The Admiral's hand shot up from the gurney, trembling, still slicked with his own blood, and he pointed directly at her. Not at the surgeon, not at the staff crowding the trauma bay doors. He pointed at the exhausted woman in wrinkled scrubs sitting alone against the far wall. The one hospital security had just finished escorting out with a cardboard box of her belongings 40 minutes ago. Her. His voice cracked but carried. Arrest her. She knows exactly what happened to my convoy. Military police moved before anyone could speak. Cold handcuffs clicked around the wrists of Emily Carver, the quiet ER nurse that Ridgeline Memorial Hospital in Cutter's Bluff, Montana had just fired. The doctors watching from the doorway didn't look horrified. They smiled. Before we go any further, if stories like this one hit you somewhere real, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week I bring you narratives that are raw, cinematic, and impossible to stop watching. Tap the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it, because what happens next inside Ridgeline Memorial will change everything you thought you knew about who the real heroes are. The morning that ended Emily Carver's nursing career at Ridgeline Memorial Hospital began the way most catastrophic days do, quietly, without any warning worth remembering. She had worked a double, 16 hours. The night shift had been brutal in the specific, grinding way that late winter nights in Cutter's Bluff always were. A semi-rollover on Route 9, 2 cardiac events back-to-back in the annex, and a 14-year-old brought in by terrified parents after a fentanyl exposure at a house party. Emily had managed all 3 simultaneously while 2 of her junior nurses were pulled to cover a staffing gap in the surgical prep ward. She hadn't eaten since the granola bar she'd folded into her scrub pocket at 6 the previous evening. By the time the morning crew arrived, her eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sandpaper, and the left side of her jaw ached from clenching it all night. She was finishing her handoff notes at the nursing station when Dr. Raymond Stokes, the attending on duty, leaned past her to refill his coffee without acknowledging she was there. That was not unusual. What happened 20 minutes later was... Chief Surgeon Dr. Marcus Holt appeared on the floor at 7:43, which was early for him. He was not a man who arrived early. He was a man who arrived when he intended to make something happen. Emily noticed the hospital administrator, Glenn Fitch, trailing 2 steps behind him. She also noticed the way Fitch kept adjusting his badge lanyard with 2 fingers, the same nervous tick she'd observed during every disciplinary meeting she'd ever sat in. She set down her pen. Holt stopped directly in front of the nursing station and looked at her with the particular brand of patience that wasn't patience at all. Emily. He said her name like it was a mild inconvenience. My office, now. She followed him without asking why. She had a reasonable guess. 3 weeks earlier, she had filed a formal incident report against Holt after a post-operative patient, a 58-year-old man named Donald Pruitt, had developed severe complications that Emily believed were directly connected to a procedural shortcut Holt had taken during a gallbladder removal. She had documented everything. She had submitted it through proper channels, with timestamps and attached chart notes, exactly the way she'd been trained. She had also made the mistake of mentioning it to 2 other nurses on the floor, which meant it had spread the way things always spread in hospitals, quietly and completely, until everyone knew and no one wanted to be seen knowing. Donald Pruitt had survived. He'd been transferred to the ICU for 4 additional days, run up a medical bill his family couldn't absorb, and gone home with a drainage issue that would require follow-up surgery. He had sent Emily a card. She still had it in her locker. Holt's office smelled like leather conditioner and the particular staleness of a room with windows that never opened. He sat behind his desk and folded his hands. Fitch stood near the door. We've completed a review of your incident report, Holt said, and of your broader performance record over the past 11 months. Emily sat with her hands in her lap. All right. The incident report has been assessed as unsubstantiated. Dr. Reyes in Quality Assurance reviewed Mr. Pruitt's case and found no deviation from standard surgical protocol. Holt's voice was smooth, deliberate, the voice of a man who had practiced this particular sentence. However, the review also surfaced a pattern of behavior that we find concerning. What pattern? Fitch cleared his throat. Holt pressed forward. Insubordination during shift handoffs. Documented conflicts with senior medical staff. Failure to follow chain of command on 2 separate occasions. and most recently sharing unverified and potentially defamatory claims about a colleague with other staff members, which created a hostile work environment. Emily looked at him steadily. The claims were documented in writing with chart timestamps. As I said, assessed as unsubstantiated by Dr. Reyes, who trained under you. A pause. Holt's jaw moved slightly. That's not relevant. I'd argue it is. Fitch spoke up from near the door. Emily, the hospital's position is that I'm being terminated. She said it flatly, not as a question. Holt nodded once. Effective immediately. HR will walk you through the severance terms. You're entitled to... I don't need the speech. She stood up. I've already read the policy manual. She walked out. In the hallway, she kept her face neutral, which took more effort than she would have admitted, and she went directly to her locker on the second floor, where she pulled out the granola bar wrappers, a spare pair of compression socks, a travel-sized hand lotion, and Donald Pruitt's card. She put everything in the cardboard box. A security officer named Warren brought her with an apologetic expression. Warren had worked nights for 11 years, and his kid had been one of Emily's patients last spring, a broken arm from a bike accident. He didn't say anything. She didn't ask him to. She carried the box to the main floor lobby and sat down on one of the padded benches near the entrance, because her car was 2 levels down in the parking structure, and she hadn't yet decided whether her legs would carry her there without shaking. She was 39 years old, and she had been a nurse for 14 years, and she had been fired once before, briefly, from a contract position during a budget restructuring that had nothing to do with her performance. But this was different. This felt like something had been deliberately taken and put somewhere she couldn't reach. She sat with the box in her lap and watched the automatic doors cycle open and closed as people moved through them, and she breathed carefully. She was still sitting there 40 minutes later when the first military vehicle pulled into the hospital's ambulance bay. Not one vehicle. 3. Then a fourth. The automatic doors opened and 2 men in battle dress utilities stepped through, moving with the kind of physical economy that Emily recognized immediately and from somewhere much deeper than memory. Behind them, a gurney came through fast, pushed by EMTs, and on it was a man in his 50s whose uniform still had blood on it despite the field dressing someone had already applied. His face was pale and tight, the color of a person running on shock and will. 2 stars on his collar. A Navy Admiral. The trauma team appeared from the hallway on cue, Dr. Holt among them, because he had apparently not yet left the building, and they converged on the gurney with the coordinated urgency that trauma bays ran on. The lobby cleared reflexively as staff moved to their stations and visitors pressed back against walls. Emily watched. She should have left. She knew that. The box was in her lap, the parking structure was 2 levels down, and she had been officially removed from this building's medical staff less than an hour ago. But she was also a 14-year emergency nurse watching a high-priority trauma case roll through a bay she knew better than her own apartment, and her feet stayed where they were. The Admiral was conscious. That was significant. He was talking, which was more significant. One of the soldiers accompanying him, a staff sergeant whose arm was wrapped in a compression bandage, was relaying information to the trauma team in rapid, clipped phrases. Emily could hear fragments from the bench. Ambush. Improvised device, blast over pressure. 3 other casualties already transported to Billings. She watched Holt take the lead position at the gurney. He was good at looking like he was in command. He had always been good at that. The next 17 minutes were the kind that separated emergency departments from each other. Not by equipment or funding, but by the specific quality of focus that either materialized under pressure or didn't. Emily watched the trauma bay through the lobby's glass partition, and she tracked what she saw with the part of her brain that never fully turned off, the part that cataloged and assessed and noticed. She noticed when the Admiral's blood pressure reading, visible on the monitor from where she stood, dropped faster than the field dressing should have allowed. She noticed when the resident assisting Holt reached for the wrong tray. She noticed when Holt himself paused. Just 2 or 3 seconds. The kind of pause that meant uncertainty rather than consideration, before the resident corrected course on her own. The box was on the bench beside her before she'd made a conscious decision to put it down. She was through the doors and inside the trauma bay before security registered that she wasn't wearing a badge. Hemothorax, left side. She said it to the room, not to anyone specifically, as she pulled on a pair of gloves from the wall dispenser. His breath sounds are unequal, and the pressure drop is too fast for the external wounds. You need a chest tube, not another line. Holt turned. The particular quality of his expression, the flash of disbelief colliding with fury, was something she cataloged automatically and filed away. You're not authorized to be in this room. Neither is attention pneumothorax if you don't address it in the next 4 minutes. She moved to the left side of the gurney, already reading the monitor with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this in conditions considerably worse than a well-lit trauma bay. Do you want to have this conversation now or after? The Admiral, still conscious, still tracking, turned his head slightly and looked at her. His eyes were sharp despite the shock, the eyes of a man who had been trained to assess threats and resources simultaneously. He said nothing. The resident, whose name tag read K. Pelham, was already looking between Emily and the monitor with the expression of someone whose training was overriding her uncertainty. She's right about the breath sounds, Pelham said quietly. I was flagging that. Holt's jaw tightened. But the monitor agreed with Emily, and so did the resident's assessment, and so did 17 minutes of evidence. And Holt was not, whatever else he was, completely willing to let a patient die in order to make a point. Not with 2 military officers in the room. Set it up, he said, to no one in particular. Emily set it up. She worked alongside Pelham with the practiced economy of someone who had done chest tubes in field conditions that made this look like a simulation exercise. The Admiral's blood pressure stabilized, his breathing normalized. His color came back slowly, the way it did when the immediate danger passed and the body remembered what it was supposed to be doing. At some point during the procedure, security arrived, Warren again, and another officer Emily didn't recognize. They waited at the bay entrance, which meant someone with authority had told them to wait. When the immediate crisis was resolved and the Admiral was stable, Emily stepped back from the gurney, peeled off her gloves, and turned to face Holt. "I'll get my box," she said. She walked out. No one stopped her. She made it back to the lobby bench and sat down again. Her hands were not shaking. She was surprised to notice that. She had expected them to shake. What she hadn't expected was the sound, 20 minutes later, of military boots on the lobby's polished floor. She looked up, and the Admiral was being moved from the trauma bay towards surgery prep. A different kind of movement now, controlled rather than urgent. And he was talking to the soldier beside him, the staff sergeant whose arm was wrapped. She couldn't hear what he was saying. She didn't need to. What she heard clearly was what came next. The Admiral raised one hand from the gurney railing, a deliberate gesture, the kind that came from a man accustomed to being immediately obeyed, and he pointed across the lobby, at her. "That woman!" His voice carried the flat authority of someone who had been giving orders in high-stakes environments for decades. "Who is she?" Fitch, who had appeared at the lobby's edge, said something Emily couldn't catch. One of the military escorts leaned in. There was a brief exchange. Then the Admiral's face changed in a way she couldn't fully read, something between recognition and calculation, and he spoke again. "Bring her. Don't let her leave the building." Emily was still holding the cardboard box when the military police officers reached the bench. The taller one, a sergeant with a careful expression, looked at the box and then at her, and then at the handcuffs on his belt. "Ma'am," he was professionally apologetic, "I need you to come with us." I understood that," she said. "There's also an order to detain you pending investigation." She finished the sentence. "Yes." She set the box down on the bench and stood up and put her wrists together in the space between them, which was not technically necessary at that point, but which made the situation clear to everyone watching. The lobby was not empty. Hospital staff had gathered at the edges, the way people gathered at emergencies, drawn to them and pretending not to be. She could see the nurses from her former floor. She could see Holt standing near the surgical wing doors with his arms crossed. The handcuffs clicked. Someone in the watching crowd exhaled audibly. Someone else, she didn't look to see who, made a sound that might have been a laugh. Emily looked straight ahead. "You'll regret this misunderstanding," she said. She wasn't speaking to the military police officers. She wasn't speaking to the room. She said it quietly, evenly, with the particular quality of certainty that only comes from knowing something other people don't know yet. Then she walked. No resistance, no scene, just a woman in wrinkled scrubs, wrists in cuffs, carrying nothing, walking ahead of military escorts through the lobby of a hospital that had fired her 1 hour ago, past the staff who'd gathered to watch, past the administrator who'd rubber-stamped her termination, past the glass partition that looked into the trauma bay, where the Admiral's stabilized vitals were still tracking on the monitor. The cardboard box with Donald Pruitt's card sat on the lobby bench where she'd left it. No one picked it up. Outside, in the ambulance bay, 2 additional military vehicles had arrived. A man in civilian clothes, but with the unmistakable bearing of federal law enforcement, was speaking quietly into a phone near the bay entrance. He looked up when Emily came through the doors. His expression was not the expression of someone who expected to see what he was seeing. He ended the call. He looked at the handcuffs. He looked at the escorts. He looked at Emily's face, which was composed in a way that seemed to confuse him slightly. He said something quietly to one of the escorts, too low for Emily to catch, and the escort said something back. The federal agent looked at Emily again. "Ms. Carver." "It's Carver," she confirmed, with an A, not an E. He studied her for a moment. "Do you know why you're being detained?" "Because the Admiral said so." "Do you know why the Admiral said so?" She looked at him steadily. "He's been told something about me that isn't true. I'd like to know who told him, but I expect you're going to figure that out before I do." The federal agent blinked, just once, quickly. Then he put his phone back in his pocket and gestured to the escorts, and they walked Emily to one of the vehicles, and she sat down on the bench seat in the back, and the door closed. Through the tinted window, she could see the ambulance bay and the hospital entrance and the lobby through the glass doors. She could see staff still gathered near the entrance. She could see Fitch talking rapidly to someone on his phone. She could also see the security footage cameras mounted above the bay entrance. 3 of them, positioned at overlapping angles, recording everything that had happened in and around the trauma bay for the past several hours. She looked at the cameras for a long moment. Then she leaned back against the vehicle's bench seat and closed her eyes, and for the first time in 16 hours, let herself be still. Inside the hospital, at that exact moment, a military intelligence officer named Sergeant Dana Brierly sat down at the hospital's network terminal in the administrative office and typed the first query of what would become a very long night. She was looking for something routine: shift logs, footage timestamps, cross-referenced personnel records. What she found instead, 7 minutes into the search, made her sit up very straight and type faster. Emily Carver's name appeared in the system. Then it didn't. Then it appeared again in fragments, a partial chart notation here, a timestamp without the accompanying entry there, like something had been deleted in a hurry by someone who knew what they were doing, but not quite well enough. Brierly pulled up the trauma bay logs from the last 2 hours and started at the beginning. She stopped at the 14-minute mark. She read it twice. Then she picked up her radio. Sergeant Dana Brierly's radio call lasted 43 seconds. She kept her voice level the way she'd been trained to, clipping her words short, giving only what the situation required. But the 2 other military intelligence analysts working the room with her could tell from the way she held herself, shoulders pulled in, one hand flat on the desk, that whatever she'd found on that screen was not a minor discrepancy. She ended the transmission and immediately picked up her phone and called the same number through a different channel. That was protocol for a reason. Outside in the ambulance bay, Emily sat in the back of the military vehicle with her eyes closed and heard nothing except the distant sound of wind coming off the mountains and, occasionally, the crackle of radio traffic from the front seat. The 2 escorts in front didn't talk to her. She didn't expect them to. She measured the minutes by the quality of the light changing through the tinted window, thin winter sunlight, the kind that gave warmth only in theory, and she kept her breathing slow and her mind organized. She had learned that particular skill in a different life, under conditions that made a military vehicle in a Montana hospital parking structure feel almost peaceful. What she was thinking about specifically was the 14-minute gap. She knew it existed. She had known it existed since the moment she'd walked out of the trauma bay and noticed, with the automatic precision of someone trained in operational documentation, that the bay's secondary recording system, the one that ran independently of the main hospital network on a backup circuit, had been blinking its indicator light in a pattern that meant it had recorded without interruption even when someone, at some point, had apparently accessed the primary system. She hadn't said this to anyone. She had no reason to, yet. But she thought about that blinking light now, in the back of the vehicle, and she let herself feel something close to careful satisfaction. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere had shifted in the way that atmospheres shift when federal presence moves from peripheral to central. Military intelligence had formally sealed the building at 8:47, a soft seal, meaning staff could move between floors, but no one was leaving the premises without clearance. And the announcement had come through the PA system in the careful, bloodless language that institutions used when they wanted compliance without panic. It produced panic anyway, of the contained, murmuring variety. Staff clustered near nursing stations. A physician from cardiology who had a tea time at 11 called the administrator's desk 4 times in 20 minutes. The cafeteria, paradoxically, was packed. Dr. Marcus Holt was not in the cafeteria. He was in his office on the 4th floor with the door closed and his desk phone's ringer turned off. And he was doing what a certain kind of person did when they sensed a situation beginning to move out of their control. He was talking, quietly, quickly, to the specific people he trusted to help him shape a narrative before someone else shaped it first. The person he was talking to at 9:14 was Glenn Fitch. She was terminated at 7:52, Holt said. He was not sitting. He was standing near the window with his back to the glass, which meant the light was behind him and his face was in shadow, which was either unconscious habit or something else. She had no authorization to be on the floor, no authorization to enter that bay. The fact that she inserted herself into a trauma situation she was explicitly removed from it's not just an HR matter at this point, Glenn. It's a liability issue. It's potentially a criminal trespass issue. Fitch was on the other end of a phone that he held so tightly the case was creaking faintly. The military investigators are going to want to talk to everyone who was in that bay. Then they'll talk it to me, and I'll tell them what happened. And what happened, Marcus? A pause. Holt turned slightly toward the window. Outside, the ambulance bay was visible from this angle, and he could see the military vehicles and the cluster of personnel moving between them. I managed a high-priority trauma case under significant pressure. My team performed appropriately. An unauthorized individual forced her way into a restricted area, created confusion, and is now apparently somehow a person of interest in a military investigation, which tells you everything about the kind of person she is. Fitch was quiet for a moment. She stabilized him. My team stabilized him. She was present. There's a difference. The creak of the window frame as something shifted in the wind outside. Make sure that distinction is clear in whatever initial statement you give them. I'm not sure I'm in a position to... Glenn. The word was quiet and very flat. We have been careful for 11 months. We are not going to lose that carefulness now because one disgruntled nurse got herself arrested by a federal admiral. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Another pause, then quietly. Yes. Holt ended the call. He stood at the window for another minute. Then he smoothed his coat, checked his reflection briefly in the dark screen of his desktop monitor, and went to the door. He had rounds to complete and investigator statements to give, and more importantly, a version of events to occupy before anyone else's version could take up the same space. He was very good at occupying space. What he didn't know, as he walked out of his office and toward the elevator, was that Sergeant Brierly had already flagged his name. Not prominently, not yet. It was a preliminary flag attached to a notation in the trauma bay log that didn't align with the verbal account the chief surgeon had given in his initial walkthrough with investigators. A small thing. The kind of thing that could be explained by stress or miscommunication or the general chaos of a high-pressure medical environment. The kind of thing that, when you found 2 of them, started to look like something else. Brierly was looking for a third. The conference room that military intelligence had requisitioned on the 2nd floor was not a comfortable space. It had been set up quickly. Laptops, cables, 2 portable hard drives, a whiteboard that someone had wiped imperfectly. So a previous meeting's agenda was still faintly visible underneath the current notes. Special Agent Renata Oakes, who was technically the senior federal presence on site and who had been the one talking quietly into a phone in the ambulance bay when Emily was escorted out, stood at the head of the room with her jacket still on and a coffee cup she hadn't touched. She was not an impatient person by nature, which was useful because the work she did required long stretches of sitting with incomplete information without making the mistake of filling the gaps prematurely. Right now, the gaps were significant. "Walk me through the timeline again," she said to Brierly, who had come up from the admin office with a printed summary. From the moment the convoy was hit, Brierly set the summary on the table. At 0640, the Admiral's convoy, 3 vehicles, standard escort configuration, was traveling on a secondary road approximately 18 miles north of Cutter's Bluff. An IED detonated under the second vehicle. The Admiral was in the lead vehicle, took blast overpressure and fragment wounds from the secondary explosion. 4 personnel were injured, 2 critically. The critically injured were airlifted to the Regional Trauma Center in Billings. The Admiral was transported here because Ridgeline Memorial was listed in the convoy's medical contingency plan as the closest Level 2 trauma facility on the route. Oakes nodded. Who had access to the convoy's route and medical contingency plan? That's being run through Naval Intelligence right now. We're waiting on the list. And the IED itself? EOD is at the scene. Preliminary assessment is military-grade construction, not something you put together from an online tutorial. Brierly paused. The positioning was specific. The detonation point was chosen to disable without immediately destroying. Whoever placed it wasn't trying to kill everyone. They were trying to create specific casualties. Oakes looked at the whiteboard. They were trying to get the Admiral to this hospital. It wasn't a question, but Brierly answered it anyway. That's one reading. What's the other reading? That it's coincidence. Oakes picked up her coffee, looked at it, put it back down. What's the flag on the trauma bay logs? Brierly flipped to the second page of her summary. The chief surgeon gave investigators a verbal account of the trauma response at approximately 8:20. He described himself as leading the team, making the critical call to address the hemothorax, and managing the procedure with his resident's assistants. He mentioned the unauthorized individual, Emily Carver, as a disruptive presence who was escorted out after the situation was stabilized. And the logs say? The logs are partially consistent with that account. Brierly set the page down. The hemothorax identification is logged at 8:03, attributed to a verbal call. The notation doesn't include a name. What the verbal account doesn't mention is that the resident's notes, which she completed on a tablet in the bay at 8:29, before she would have known there was any discrepancy to worry about, attribute the hemothorax identification to a woman she describes as the nurse from before, the one they said had been let go. Oakes was quiet for a moment. The resident wrote that down before she knew it mattered. Yes. Which means she wasn't constructing a story. She was just writing down what happened. Yes. Oakes stood up and went to the whiteboard and wrote a single word on it, somewhat to the left of center, Carver. Then she drew a line from that word to another space and wrote, Holt. She capped the marker and looked at the board. Pull everything on both of them, she said. And I want to talk to the Admiral before he goes under anesthesia. The Admiral's name was Raymond Calloway, Vice Admiral, United States Navy, with a service record that Oakes had reviewed on the drive from the Federal Field Office in Helena, and found to be exactly as distinguished as it needed to be to make this situation considerably more complicated than a routine medical investigation. I was scheduled for surgery at 10:30 to address internal bleeding that had been temporarily controlled in the trauma bay. Between now and that window, he was in a prep room on the 3rd floor, conscious and medicated lightly enough to remain coherent, which he'd apparently insisted upon. Oakes went in alone. Calloway was propped at a slight angle on the bed, the way patients were when they wanted to feel less like patients. He had the coloring of someone who had lost too much blood too fast and was currently running on controlled substances and stubbornness, which was not an unusual combination in the people she dealt with. Special Agent Oakes. He looked at her without expression. They told me you were coming. How are you feeling, Admiral? Like I was near an explosion. He said it without apparent irony. What do you have? She appreciated that. We're early in the investigation. I have questions. That's honest. Sit down. She sat. The woman you flagged, Emily Carver. Can you tell me how you know that name? Something shifted in Calloway's face. Not quite a wince, more the expression of a man recalibrating something he'd been certain about. A member of my staff told me. On the way in, said there was a nurse at this hospital who'd made claims about her military background that didn't check out. Said she'd been fired for misconduct and that she'd been present at the convoy departure point earlier this week. He paused. He said she might be connected to whoever knew our route. Which member of your staff told you this? A pause that lasted slightly too long. Lieutenant Garver, Darren Garver. He's been on my administrative detail for 8 months. Oakes wrote the name in her notebook. Where's Lieutenant Garver now? He was in the second vehicle. Calloway's voice stayed level, but something underneath it didn't. He was one of the 2 critically injured. He's in Billings. She wrote that down. When did he tell you this, about Carver? At approximately 0620. We were preparing to move out. He came to me directly. Calloway's jaw tightened. He seemed concerned, credible. Had you heard the name Emily Carver before that moment? Another pause. No. Oakes looked at her notebook. Admiral, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think about it carefully before you answer. In your own assessment, in the time you were conscious and present in that trauma bay, what did you observe Emily Carver do? Calloway was quiet for a long moment. The monitor beside him beeped its steady rhythm. Outside in the hallway, someone's shoes squeaked against the floor and then faded. She identified the hemothorax, he said finally. I heard her say it. I watched her set up the chest tube. My blood pressure stabilized afterward. He looked at the ceiling rather than at Oakes. She knew what she was doing. She moved the way... He stopped. She moved the way people move when they've done that particular thing in a situation where doing it wrong would get someone killed. And you still ordered her detained. I was given information that she was a threat. His voice was flat. I acted on that information. Who gave Lieutenant Carver that information? Do you know? Calloway looked at her directly. That's what you need to find out. It was. Oakes stood up and thanked him and told him she'd follow up after his surgery, and she walked back out into the hallway and called the field office in Helena and told them to find every communication Lieutenant Darren Carver had sent or received in the 72 hours preceding 0640. Then she walked back toward the conference room, and on the way she passed the administrative wing, and through a glass partition she saw something that made her slow her pace. Glenn Fitch was at a computer terminal in the records office. He was alone. His back was to the glass, and he was typing with both hands in the rapid, slightly uncoordinated way of someone who was not a fast typist but was trying to be. Oakes stopped walking. She stood outside the glass for 4 seconds, which was long enough to assess what she was seeing without making a decision about it. Then she kept moving, and she got on her radio, and she gave a very quiet instruction to the analyst covering the network monitoring station. Flag any file modifications in the administrative record system from the past 40 minutes. The response came back in under a minute. Already flagged. 11 files accessed, 7 modified. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she was already walking faster. Back in the conference room, Brierly had a second monitor running beside the first, and on it was the beginning of a personnel file that had taken considerably more clearance to access than standard hospital employment records. This just came through from the Pentagon, Brierly said. You're going to want to read it. Oakes looked at the screen. The file was Emily Carver's. The real one. Not the one in Ridgeline Memorial's HR system. It was classified. Not lightly classified in the way that bureaucratic caution classified things. Actually classified, with the kind of access restrictions that required Oakes to use her federal credentials to even view the index. The file itself was largely redacted, long blocks of black where the operational specifics had been removed. But the structure of what remained was enough. Service dates, attached units, a medical specialty designation that was not standard nursing, a call sign listed in the mission appendix, no individual missions listed by name, but a notation at the bottom of the page that read, personnel associated with this file linked to 7+ classified special operations support actions. Details available at TSSCI clearance level only. Brierly pointed at the call sign notation. I cross-referenced that against Naval Special Warfare's Commendations Archive. I can't access the classified details, but the index shows 3 commendation actions tied to that identifier. Personnel commendation, combat medic designation, and She paused. 1 Silver Star recommendation, classified reason for classification listed as operational security. Oakes stood very still. She was recommended for a Silver Star. Yes, and no one here knew that. She would have had reason to not disclose it, Brierly said carefully. If the missions were classified, disclosing her association with them could have compromised. I understand what classified means. Oakes looked at the screen for another moment. Then she looked at the whiteboard, at the 2 names connected by a line, and she walked over and wrote a 3rd word in the upper corner, convoy. Then she drew a line from convoy to Holt. She stood back and looked at it. What did the 7 modified files in the administrative system contain? She asked, without turning around. Brierly checked her second screen. 3 were patient charts. 2 were shift logs from this week. 1 was a personnel file. She paused. 1 was an incident report filed 11 months ago. Oakes turned around. Against who? The incident report was filed by Emily Carver against Dr. Marcus Holt regarding a post-operative complication that Carver alleged resulted from procedural negligence. Brierly looked up. The modification timestamp is from 11 minutes ago. Someone changed the outcome notation from under review to resolved unsubstantiated. The room was very quiet. That modification was made before we flagged the system, Oakes said, by 43 minutes. But we have the original. Brierly allowed herself a small, tired smile. Backup servers don't give people a lot of warning before they sync. Oakes nodded. She looked at the board again. The 3 words, Carver, Holt, Convoy, and the lines between them. Incomplete, still. Missing pieces she could feel the shape of but not yet name. She was about to speak when the door opened and one of the junior analysts put his head in with the expression of someone delivering news he hadn't fully processed yet. The network logs, he said, from the security system. He looked at his tablet. We found something in the deletion records. 12 trauma bay entries were removed from the primary system between 8:05 and 8:20 this morning. Removed by who? The access credentials belonged to Dr. Marcus Holt. Silence. Then, from the hallway outside, clear enough to carry through the open door, came the sound of a voice she'd heard before. Measured, professionally confident, moving toward the conference room with the casual assurance of someone who had not yet understood the shape of what was waiting for him. Holt. He was coming to give his formal statement. Oakes straightened her jacket, capped her marker, and turned to face the door. Close that file, she said to Brierly quietly. Leave the board exactly as it is. Holt appeared in the doorway a moment later. I was composed, freshly composed, in the way of someone who had spent a few minutes preparing, and he looked at the conference room and the laptops and the whiteboard and the 2 women in the room with the even, faintly magnanimous expression of a senior physician arriving to help with something slightly beneath his usual concerns. He looked at the board. His eyes moved across Carver, then the line, then Holt. Something happened in his face. Very brief. Gone before anyone without training would have caught it. Oakes smiled at him. Dr. Holt, thank you for coming in. Please, sit down. He sat, smoothly, precisely, with his hands folded on the table in front of him. I'm happy to assist however I can. That's exactly what we're counting on, Oakes said, and opened her notebook to a fresh page. 3 floors down, Emily Carver was still in the back of the military vehicle when the door opened and a different escort appeared. Not Warren, not the sergeant who'd cuffed her. A younger specialist who looked like he'd received new instructions recently and wasn't entirely sure what to make of them. Ma'am, we're moving you inside. Holding room on the 2nd floor. All right. She stood and stepped out. The ambulance bay was busier than before. More vehicles, more personnel. A white van she recognized from federal evidence protocols. The specialist walked a step behind her, not touching her arm, which meant the energy of this had shifted somewhere between a detention and something that didn't quite have a name yet. Inside, at the 2nd floor holding room, a small consultation office that had been cleared and designated, Emily sat in a chair near the window and looked out at the parking structure and the flat winter sky above it. But I'm also telling you that the man who had me fired this morning has been modifying patient records for considerably longer than this morning, and at least some of what he's been doing connects to why that convoy was on that road and why someone needed a specific set of casualties to arrive at this specific hospital. Oakes didn't move. That's a significant claim. Yes. Emily held her gaze. Check the pharmacy dispensing logs for the past 4 months. Cross-reference them against the patient transfer records for military-adjacent casualties. Then check who signed off on the inter-facility transfer recommendations. She leaned forward slightly. And then check who in this hospital has been receiving deposits from a numbered account linked to a medical logistics contractor that has no active contracts with any hospital in this state. The room was very quiet. Oakes looked at her for a long moment. Then she wrote something in her notebook. How do you know about the account? She asked. Emily looked at her hands for a moment. Because I found the first transaction 8 months ago when I was trying to understand why a patient who should have been treated here was transferred to a facility 3 hours away at significant cost to his family, and significant benefit to someone I couldn't yet name. She looked up. I reported it internally, through the proper channels, to the compliance officer. She paused. The compliance officer is Glenn Fitch. Oakes set her pen down. Outside in the hallway, someone's radio crackled with a burst of static, and then a voice, brief and urgent, that Oakes couldn't quite make out. But her phone buzzed in her jacket pocket at the same moment, and she pulled it out and looked at the screen. And whatever she read there made the careful, professional neutrality of her expression briefly, completely, fall away. She stood up. "Stay here," she said to Emily. "I wasn't planning to go anywhere," Emily said. Oakes was already at the door. She pulled it open and looked back once, and in that look was something Emily recognized. Not surprise exactly, but the particular expression of someone who had been following a thread and suddenly understood they'd underestimated how far it went. Then she was gone, and the door was closed, and Emily sat alone in the quiet consultation room while the sound of rapid footsteps moved down the hallway outside, and more voices joined them, and somewhere on another floor, an alarm that had nothing to do with any patient began to ring. The alarm was on the 3rd floor. Emily heard it through the consultation room's thin walls. Not a fire alarm, not a code blue, but the specific 3-pulse pattern that Ridgeline Memorial used for a security breach, which she knew because she had worked here for 2 years and had memorized every sound this building made, the way you memorized a place you spent more hours in than your own home. 3 pulses. Pause. 3 pulses again. It meant an unauthorized access event somewhere in the building's restricted zones. She sat with that information for approximately 4 seconds. Then she stood up and went to the door and tried the handle. Unlocked. Whatever instructions had been given to the escort outside had apparently not included explicit containment, or the escort had moved toward the alarm, or both. The hallway outside was not empty, but it was close. A single analyst at the far end talking rapidly into a phone, his back to her. And the sounds coming from the stairwell to her left were the sounds of people moving upward, not down. She didn't leave. She considered it, briefly and honestly, and then she didn't, because leaving would cost her everything she was currently positioned to gain and would confirm every version of events that Holt needed people to believe. Instead, she stood in the open doorway and listened, and what she heard, underneath the alarm and the radio traffic and the footsteps, was a voice she recognized. Dr. Holt, somewhere above her, speaking at a volume and pitch that indicated he was no longer performing composure. She couldn't make out the words. The tone was enough. Upstairs, the reason for his composure's failure was standing in the doorway of his office. Oakes had gone directly from the consultation room to the 3rd floor when her phone showed her the message from the network analyst. A live access event, someone using Holt's own credentials to attempt a second round of file modifications, while Holt was sitting in the conference room 2 floors below, which meant either Holt had given his credentials to someone else, or someone had taken them without his knowledge. And either option was, at this particular moment, deeply instructive. She'd arrived at the office door at the same time as 2 of her agents, and what they found inside was a man who was not Holt. A younger man, heavy-set, in a hospital facilities uniform, sitting at Holt's desk with a look of someone who had just realized the exit he'd planned on was no longer available. His name, according to the badge on his uniform, was Kevin Drawl, facilities manager, 2nd floor. He did not run. He looked at the agents and at Oakes and then at the laptop open in front of him, and he did the specific calculation that people did when they understood that the math of their situation had already been completed by someone else, and the answer was not in their favor. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's a reasonable thing to want," Oakes said. She looked at the laptop screen. The file open on it was the incident report Emily had filed 11 months ago, the same one that had been modified 43 minutes earlier, now open again, the cursor positioned in the outcome field. "Don't close that." Her agent photographed the screen. 2 others began the process of securing Drawl, who came without resistance and with the hollow, deflated quality of someone whose plan had lasted considerably less time than anticipated. Holt had arrived during this process, coming from the elevator with the confident stride of a man expecting to return to his office between interview sessions, and he had stopped in the hallway outside his own door and looked at Drawl being walked out by federal agents and his laptop being bagged as evidence. And the composure he'd spent the morning maintaining had come apart in the specific way that composure comes apart when the scenario a person has been managing in their head collides with a version of reality they didn't plan for. What is this? Not a question, the kind of statement that people made when they needed a moment. Dr. Holt, Oakes turned from the office doorway. We had some additional questions. Do you want to step back down to the conference room, or that is my office, that is my laptop? His voice had an edge now that hadn't been there before. Whatever that man was doing in my office, I had no knowledge of. That's consistent with one possible explanation, Oakes said. We'll want to go through all of them, shall we? He went. But something had changed in the going, and everyone in that hallway could feel it. Downstairs, in the conference room, Brierly had the secondary security system footage up on her screen, the backup circuit, the one running independently off the hospital's main network, the one with the blinking indicator light. It had taken their tech specialist 40 minutes and a call to the building's original security contractor to locate the physical recorder, which was housed in a utility panel on the first floor behind a maintenance access door that someone had clearly not anticipated investigators would know to look for. The footage was not high resolution. It was the grainy, time-stamped output of a system installed 8 years ago that no one had upgraded because no one had thought it mattered. It mattered now. Brierly watched the trauma bay footage from 8:03 through 8:27, and she watched it without speaking, and when it ended, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she called Oakes. You need to see the backup footage, she said. Now, before the Admiral goes into surgery. Oakes was back in the conference room in 6 minutes. She sat down beside Brierly, and they watched the footage together, from the beginning, without talking. What the footage showed was not complicated. It was in fact remarkably clear for a grainy 8-year-old backup system, clear in the way that things are clear when you're watching them without the filter of someone else's account layered over the top. It showed Emily Carver entering the trauma bay at 8:03. It showed her moving to the gurney immediately, without hesitation, pulling on gloves. It showed her speaking. The audio was poor, intermittent, but the word hemothorax was audible at 8:04, captured by the system's microphone during a moment when the ambient noise dipped. It showed Dr. Marcus Holt standing at the head of the gurney. Standing, not directing, not managing the room. Standing with his hands at his sides and his head slightly angled in the specific posture of someone who has encountered a situation that has exceeded the border of their actual competence and is waiting for the situation to resolve itself. It showed the resident, Dr. Pelham, moving to assist Emily. Not Holt. Emily. It showed Emily leading the chest tube setup with Pelham assisting, the two of them working with the economy of people who were focused on the task rather than the audience. Holt moved once during this sequence, stepping to the monitor, adjusting something with the deliberate slowness of a man who needed to appear to be doing something. At 8:17, the Admiral's blood pressure line on the monitor behind them stabilized. Emily stepped back. Pelham made a notation on her tablet. Holt turned to the room and said something. The audio didn't catch it. But his posture changed, the shoulders came back, the stance widened, and two nurses near the bay entrance straightened as if responding to an instruction from someone in authority. At 8:20, Holt gestured toward Emily. Two security officers appeared. At 8:23, Emily was walked out of the bay. At 8:26, Holt was at the secondary workstation, his back to the camera, his hands on the keyboard. The footage ended at 8:27 when the backup system's recording buffer reset automatically, as it did every hour and 23 minutes, and started a new file. The new file, beginning at 8:27, would capture everything that happened in the trauma bay for the next segment, including any conversations, including anyone who came back to that workstation. Oakes looked at Brierly. "Get me the second file," she said, already pulling it. While Brierly worked, Oakes went to the whiteboard and drew a new line, from Holt directly to Convoy, and then added a fourth word, lower on the board, in the space that had been waiting for it, network. She underlined it twice. What the pharmacy dispensing logs had started to show, in the 3 hours since the network analyst had flagged them, per Emily's instruction, was a pattern that was subtle enough to have escaped notice in routine audits, but was not subtle enough to survive the specific scrutiny being applied to it now. Over a period of approximately 9 months, certain medications ordered for patients with military-associated injury profiles had been dispensed at quantities that didn't match the documented dosages. The discrepancy wasn't large in any single instance. Cumulatively, across 17 patients, It represented a volume of controlled substances that had been signed out of inventory and not accounted for in patient records. The sign-out authorizations all carried the same attending physician override code, Marcus Holt's code. Cross-referenced against the patient transfer records Emily had mentioned, the ones where patients had been moved at unusual cost to facilities 3 hours away. A picture was assembling that was not yet complete but was already too coherent to be accidental. 4 of the transferred patients had been military veterans with injuries sustained in circumstances that put them in contact with federal law enforcement. 3 of them had been transferred before they could give full statements to investigating officers. 1 of them had died at the receiving facility under circumstances that his family had contested and that the state medical board had reviewed and closed without findings. Brierly pulled the second backup footage file and started it from the beginning, and at the 4-minute mark she paused it. She called Oakes back to the screen. At the workstation in the trauma bay, at 8:31, a figure had returned, not Holt. Holt was in his formal interview session at that time, which Brierly had time-stamped. This was someone else, smaller, moving quickly, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this particular task before and needed to complete it before anyone checked. The figure accessed the workstation. The figure typed. The figure left. The badge on the figure's coat, visible for 2 frames as they turned to leave, read, Drale, K. Facilities. Oakes stood up straight. Kevin Drale wasn't acting alone, she said. It wasn't a conclusion she'd just reached. It was one she was confirming out loud so Brierly could confirm it with her. No, Brierly said. He's the hands. Someone told him what to access and when. And they told him in a window after Holt was already sitting with us, which means the instruction came during the interview, or just before. Holt had his phone until we asked him to surrender it at the start of the formal session. Brierly paused, which was at 8:52. Drale had been in the trauma bay at 8:31. That was a 21-minute window. Oakes looked at the phone sitting in the evidence bag on the corner of the table. Holt's phone, surrendered at the start of the session, locked. Get a warrant for that phone, she said, right now. The warrant came through in 40 minutes, which was fast for a federal warrant and spoke to the quality of what the office in Helena had been watching develop over the course of the morning. By the time Brierly had the phone data extracted and filtered to the relevant window, Oakes was in the hallway outside surgery prep, where the Admiral's procedure had been delayed pending one conversation that she'd specifically requested and that the surgical team had, with visible reluctance, agreed to allow. Calloway was not happy about the delay. He was also not pretending to be something other than a man running low on reserves, which Oakes found, in the moment, more reassuring than anything professional composure would have offered. How long? He said. 5 minutes. Maybe less. He nodded tightly. Then make them count. She pulled a tablet from under her arm and turned the screen toward him. On it was a still image from the backup footage. Emily at the gurney, hands on the chest tube set up, posture focused and precise. Calloway looked at it for a long moment without speaking. That's from 8:04, Oakes said. Backup system, independent circuit, unmodified. She swiped to the next image. Holt, standing, hands at sides, posture unmistakable. This is at 8:06. Another long silence. The log entries that attributed the hemothorax call in the procedure to Dr. Holt were modified at 8:26, Oakes continued, using Dr. Holt's credentials from that workstation. She swiped again, the back of a figure at a workstation, Holt's posture. A second modification was attempted this morning using a facilities employee who accessed Dr. Holt's office while Holt was in our interview session. We have footage of that as well. Calloway was looking at the tablet with the expression of someone who had been in enough situations that required absolute honesty to recognize what that requirement felt like. It felt like this. The information I received, he said slowly, about Emily Carver, about her being present at the convoy departure point, about her background not checking out. Lieutenant Carver communicated that to you. Yes. We've reviewed Lieutenant Carver's communications from the 72 hours preceding the incident. He received a message at 22:14 the night before from a number registered to a disposable carrier. The message contained Emily Carver's name, her employment information, and a specific characterization of her background. Oakes paused. It also contained the convoy route. The monitor beeped. Calloway didn't look at it. Someone gave Carver the convoy route, he said. Yes, which Carver may or may not have known he was receiving. We don't yet know whether he understood the full context of what he was relaying to you. That's part of what we're investigating. And the route itself. Who had access to the route? That's being run through naval intelligence. But in parallel, we found financial records suggesting Dr. Holt has been receiving payments from a logistics network that has overlap with at least 2 individuals who are currently under federal investigation for military contract fraud. The specific nature of that network's interest in this hospital is still being established. She held his gaze. But the pattern of patient transfers, the medication discrepancies, the targeting of a specific road and a specific convoy, this was not opportunistic, Admiral. Someone needed you at this hospital, and someone needed Emily Carver discredited before you arrived. Calloway closed his eyes. Just for a second. When he opened them, his voice was different. Not softer, harder, but differently hard. The kind of hard that comes from making a decision rather than from managing a situation. Release her, he said. Remove the cuffs. Full release my authorization. Already drafted, Oakes said. I needed your confirmation before executing it given the original detention order. You have it. He looked at the tablet one more time. Is she all right? She's been waiting in a consultation room for 3 hours. She's... Oakes paused, searching for the right word. Patient. Calloway made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was not entirely not one either. Yes, he said. I imagine she is. The surgical team reappeared at the end of the hallway with the collective expression of medical professionals whose patience had reached its professional limit, and Oakes stepped back from the prep room and made the call. Downstairs, Emily heard the door to the consultation room open and looked up. The specialist from before, the younger one, the one who'd moved her inside, stood in the doorway with the restrained, careful expression of someone executing an instruction they hadn't expected. Ms. Carver. He produced a small key. The Admiral has authorized your full release. I need to... He glanced at her wrists where the cuffs had been since the ambulance bay. I'm sorry these have been on this long. There was some miscommunication about the holding parameters. Emily held out her wrists without comment and let him remove them. The skin underneath was reddened, slightly abraded. She'd moved her hands more than was probably wise during the hours of waiting, the habitual restlessness of someone unaccustomed to being still. She rubbed her wrists briefly and stood up. Where do I need to be? She asked. Agent Oakes is requesting you stay available in the building. Beyond that, you're not restricted. He hesitated. There's also... Dr. Pelham has been asking about you. The resident. She's on 2. Emily nodded once. Thank you. She walked out into the hallway and stood for a moment with the particular sense of disorientation that came from moving from a confined space into an open one after several hours. The hospital smelled the same. Antiseptic, recycled air, the faint underlying note of floor wax. And the sounds were the same, the PA system's periodic updates, the distant elevator, the background percussion of a building full of people doing urgent work. It was strange how familiar it was. How little the firing and the cuffs and the 3 hours in a consultation room had changed the specific texture of this place. She took the stairs to the 2nd floor. Pelham was at the nursing station making notes on a tablet, and she looked up when Emily came through the stairwell door. Her expression moved through several things quickly: relief, uncertainty, something that might have been guilt. I heard what happened, Pelham said. In the lobby. When they... She stopped. I should have said something sooner, in the bay. When they were asking who identified the hemothorax and I heard Holt say... Another stop. I wrote it down on my tablet. The truth, right after. Before anyone told me what the official account was going to be. I know, Emily said. Pelham blinked. You know? You're not someone who forgets details, and you're not someone who changes them after the fact. That was obvious inside of 10 minutes working with you. Emily looked at her steadily. Your notes were part of what flagged the discrepancy. A long exhale from Pelham. I wasn't trying to be brave. I was just writing down what happened. That's usually enough, Emily said. She meant it simply, without drama, and Pelham seemed to understand that because the relief on her face deepened slightly, and she nodded and looked at her tablet and then back up. The investigators have been asking about the past 11 months, Pelham said quietly. About patterns. Things I might have noticed. And? There were things I thought were inefficiencies. Transfers that seemed strange. A few times when medication orders didn't match what I'd have expected for the patient profile. She hesitated. I filed one informal query about it early on and nothing came of it, and I let it go. I told myself there were things I didn't understand yet, that I was new. Emily looked at her for a moment. How long ago was that query? 7 months. 7 months. Filed informally, not through Fitch. Something that could have been looked at and wasn't, or looked at and suppressed, or ignored because a second-year resident's informal query was easy to ignore when you controlled who read the queries. Tell the investigators exactly what you told me, Emily said. The informal query. When you filed it, what you observed, what came of it. Pelham nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something else, something in a different register, but Emily's phone, returned to her when the cuffs came off, set to silent since before the morning shift, buzzed in her scrub pocket. She pulled it out. The text was from a number she didn't recognize. 4 words. They found the account. She stared at it for 2 seconds. Then she looked up and found the nearest window. Through it, the parking structure, the flat winter sky, the cluster of federal vehicles that had grown over the course of the morning. And beyond the vehicles, arriving from the access road that ran along the hospital's eastern perimeter, 2 more cars she hadn't seen before. Dark, unmarked federal plates. Not local field office vehicles. The configuration was different. She had worked in classified environments long enough to know what different federal jurisdictions looked like in their vehicle choices, and the cars coming up the access road were from something above the field office level. Something had escalated. She pocketed the phone and turned back to Pelham. Go find the investigators. Right now. Don't wait for them to come to you. Pelham left immediately, and Emily stood at the window for a moment longer, watching the cars pull into the ambulance bay with the specific efficiency of vehicles that didn't park, they positioned. What she knew about the account was what she had told Oakes, a numbered account, a logistics contractor, deposits that didn't correspond to any legitimate contract she could find. What she didn't know, because she'd reached the limit of what she could access from a standard hospital network terminal before she was fired, was who owned the contractor. She had a guess. She had been working on a guess for 8 months, building it carefully from what she could find without crossing lines she couldn't uncross. But a guess and a federal financial trace were different things, and if Oakes's people had found the account, the actual account, the underlying ownership, then the guess was about to become something with a name and an arrest record. She needed to be in the room when that happened, not for satisfaction, not for the particular vindication of watching someone be named and taken. She needed to be in the room because her classified service record contained operational details that were directly relevant to what that contractor's network had been doing, and she was the only person currently in this building with both the clearance to access those details and the institutional knowledge of what they connected to. She had known this moment was coming for 8 months. She had been patient with it, the way she was patient with all things that required time and evidence and the cooperation of systems that moved slowly. She walked to the stairwell and took the stairs up. On the 3rd floor, she found the conference room by sound, the controlled, pressured murmur of people working fast toward something, and she stood in the hallway outside it. Through the window in the door, she could see Brierly at a laptop, Oakes on the phone, and a man she didn't recognize in a jacket that indicated he was from one of the cars outside, setting a hard drive on the conference table with the deliberate care of someone transporting something significant. On the whiteboard, visible through the glass, she could see her own name and Holt's name and the word network. Below network, someone had written a new word in larger letters, underlined once. She had to angle slightly to read it. The word was meridian. Emily went very still. She knew that name. She knew it from a context so specific and so classified that reading it on a whiteboard in a hospital conference room in Cutter's Bluff, Montana, produced a sensation she could only describe as the world reducing itself to a single sharp point. Meridian was not a medical logistics contractor. Meridian was an operations network that she had spent 14 months, not as a nurse, as something else entirely. Helping the right people document before the classified work she was attached to was shut down for political reasons, and the file was sealed, and Meridian had apparently taken that sealing as an opportunity to reconstitute under different operational parameters. She had not known they were here. She had not known this hospital, this specific mechanism of patient transfers and medication diversion, was theirs. She had found the financial thread without knowing what it connected to, because the connection was classified and she no longer had active access. But she had the operational history. She had the context. She had 14 months of documented pattern recognition that no one else in this building, possibly no one else in this state, possessed. She pushed open the conference room door. Oakes looked up from her phone. "Meridian," Emily said. She said it without inflection, without the quality of a question. "That's the network." The room went quiet. The man with the hard drive turned around slowly. His jacket, she could now see, had a small insignia above the left breast pocket. Not FBI, not ATF, not any of the standard federal law enforcement agencies. She recognized the insignia. He recognized her too. She could see it in the way his expression shifted, the rapid recalculation of someone encountering a variable they hadn't expected in the room. "Ms. Carver," Oakes said carefully, watching both of them. "Do you know Agent Harwick?" Emily looked at him steadily. "We've met," she said, "in a different context." Harwick looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Oakes. "Clear the room," he said quietly. "Please. Everyone except Carver and the senior investigator." He set the hard drive on the table with precise, deliberate care. "There's a classified briefing that should have happened 6 months ago, and it needs to happen now." Brierly was the last one out. She paused at the door with the expression of someone who had a professional objection and the situational awareness to not voice it, and then she pulled the door closed behind her, and the conference room contained 3 people and 1 hard drive, and the particular quality of silence that preceded disclosures that couldn't be undisclosed. Harwick sat down. He did it the way people sat when they were tired, in a way that sleep didn't fix, a specific, accumulated exhaustion that had been running longer than today. He put both hands on the table beside the hard drive and looked at Emily with the expression of someone revising a calculation they'd thought was finished. "You found Meridian from inside this hospital," he said, "without active clearance, without access to the classified file architecture." "I found a financial thread," Emily said. She sat across from him. Oakes stayed standing near the whiteboard, which was the right position for someone who understood they were about to receive information and needed to track it. "I didn't know it was Meridian until I saw the name on that board 20 minutes ago. But you knew the thread was significant." "I knew a patient was transferred before he could give a statement to federal investigators. I knew the transfer was authorized by someone who had no clinical reason to authorize it. And I knew the financial signature of that authorization didn't match any legitimate contracting structure I could find." She paused. "I filed a report internally. It went to Fitch." Harwick nodded slowly. "Fitch has been a Meridian facilitator for approximately 14 months. The number landed in the room and stayed there. He was recruited 6 months before you arrived at this hospital," Harwick continued. "The recruitment happened through a consulting arrangement that looked legitimate from the outside, a healthcare efficiency firm that Meridian uses as a front for identifying and compromising administrative personnel at facilities with military-adjacent patient populations." He looked at the hard drive. "What Meridian does, at its operational core, is interrupt federal investigations by disrupting witness availability. They identify patients in military or law enforcement-adjacent cases, gain access to their medical environments, and manage their care in ways that create delays, complications, or outcomes that are useful to the network's clients." Oakes spoke from near the whiteboard. "Clients. Defense contractors under federal investigation, criminal organizations with exposure to military law enforcement. 3 active cases in the past 2 years where key witnesses experienced unexpected medical deterioration at facilities that we can now connect to Meridian's financial network." Harwick's voice was level, the levelness of someone who had been living with this information long enough that the outrage had compressed into something denser and quieter. "Holt was recruited 8 months ago. He was in debt, significant personal debt from a malpractice settlement that his insurance didn't fully cover. Meridian's approach was financial initially, then it became operational. The medication diversions," Oakes said. "The diversions were partly financial and partly functional. The controlled substances were resold through a secondary network. But the more significant operational use was pharmacological management of specific patients, slowing recovery timelines, inducing complications that justified transfers, creating medical rationales for removing people from facilities where they might be interviewed." He stopped. "The patient who died at the receiving facility, his name was Bernard Osei. He was a retired Army logistics specialist who had witnessed a specific transaction that implicated one of Meridian's primary clients in a procurement fraud case worth approximately $400 million. The room absorbed that. O.C.'s death, Emily said, is currently being investigated as a homicide, Harwick confirmed. The receiving facility is being reviewed. We believe the mechanism was pharmacological and administered after transfer, which is why the state medical board found nothing at Ridgeline. By the time Osei deteriorated, he was 3 hours away. He looked at Emily. You filed the query about Osei's transfer. Informally, 7 months ago. I didn't know what I was looking at then. I just knew the transfer didn't make sense clinically. She looked at her hands for a moment. He sent his wife to thank me after his first surgery here. She brought cookies. A pause. He was doing well. The silence that followed had a different texture than the ones before it. Harwick let it be what it was, and then moved forward, because there was still ground to cover, and the clock running in the background of all of this was not theoretical. Holt was in federal custody pending formal charges. Drawl was in custody. Fitch had been detained 20 minutes ago by agents who had found him attempting to access the parking structure with a bag that contained a laptop, 2 external drives, and a one-way ticket to Seattle departing that evening. The administrative tier of the conspiracy was contained, or was close to it. What wasn't contained was the upstream, the client, the specific individual or entity that Meridian had been serving when they planted a lie in Lieutenant Carver's communications, manufactured a connection between Emily and the convoy, and arranged for the Admiral to arrive at a hospital where they controlled the chief surgeon and the compliance officer. The convoy was the escalation, Harwick said. Calloway has been heading a naval intelligence review of the procurement fraud case. He was the senior officer with authorization to compel testimony from the witness pool, and he'd been building toward a specific deposition that was scheduled for 3 weeks from today. Meridian's client needed that deposition disrupted. The IED was designed to injure, not kill. They needed Calloway incapacitated and in a compromised medical environment, not martyred. Martyrs create the wrong kind of attention. They needed him alive and in Holt's care, Oakes said, for long enough to manage his recovery in ways that would delay or complicate his capacity to oversee the deposition. Medical necessity is a remarkably effective legal mechanism for postponing federal proceedings. Harwick looked at Emily. And they needed you removed from the picture before he arrived, because your presence created a variable they couldn't control. Emily was quiet for a moment. They knew my background. Meridian maintains files on personnel at their target facilities. When they recruited Holt and Fitch and identified you as an obstacle, your incident report, your ongoing documentation of the medication discrepancies, they ran you through their intelligence network. Your classified file came back restricted, but the restriction itself was informative. They knew you weren't just a nurse. They didn't know the specific operational details, but they knew enough to understand that you were a threat to their environment. He paused. The plan to use Carver to discredit you was implemented 3 days ago when they confirmed the convoy route. They gave Carver just enough, your name, your employment, a manufactured connection to the convoy departure point, and let him carry it to Calloway in good faith. Carver didn't know, Oakes said. We believe he was genuinely dashed. He's been cooperative since Billings confirmed he was stable enough to be interviewed. He received the message, believed it was from a verified intelligence source, the number was spoofed to resemble an official channel, and did what any protective aide would do, he told his commanding officer. Harwick's expression registered something brief and difficult. He's been asking about the Admiral since he came out of surgery, and about the nurse. Emily didn't respond to that directly. The upstream client, she said instead. Do you have a name? Harwick looked at the hard drive. We have a corporate structure, 17 layers of it, built over 6 years. The financial trace your people started this morning, he nodded toward Oakes. Connected to the trace our team has been running for 14 months, and in the last 2 hours, the intersection of those traces identified a beneficial owner. He opened the hard drive's case, connected it to a laptop, and turned the screen toward them. His name is Philip Drath. He runs a defense consulting firm headquartered in Northern Virginia. His firm has 7 active federal contracts. He's testified before 2 Senate committees in the past 3 years on defense procurement reform. A pause. He had Bernard Osei killed to protect a fraud scheme that has billed the federal government for approximately $800 million in ghost contracts over 4 years. On the screen, a photograph. A man in his 60s, silver-haired, the kind of face that appeared on conference brochures and donor lists, and the background of handshake photographs with senators. The kind of face that had learned to perform trustworthiness so thoroughly that the performance had become the only legible surface. Oakes looked at it for a long moment. Where is he now? His office in Virginia was contacted this morning by our team under a cover pretext. He was present. He is currently, Harwick checked his phone, being kept present by a secondary pretext while we finalize the federal arrest warrant. He looked up. The warrant will be executed within the hour. He said it with the careful, contained quality of someone who had been working toward a specific moment for 14 months and was not going to allow himself to feel the full weight of it until it was done. Emily understood that quality. She had it herself. She looked at the screen for another moment and then looked away, because Drath's face was not the thing that required her attention right now. What required her attention was the next several hours and the specific sequence of events that she could see taking shape. The arrest, the public disclosure, the institutional cascade that would follow, and her position within that sequence. The Admiral's surgery, she said. How did it go? Completed 40 minutes ago. He's in recovery. Harwick looked at her. He's been briefed on the basics. He asked to speak with you before any public statement is made. She nodded. When he's ready. There's also the matter of your employment status. Harwick closed the laptop. The termination this morning was executed under conditions that were, I know what it was executed under. She wasn't dismissive, just direct. That's a separate process. It can wait for the appropriate sequence. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone recalibrating, again, who they were dealing with. You're not? He stopped. What? Most people in your position after the morning you've had would be leading with that. Most people in my position haven't been watching a man like Holt operate for 11 months with institutional protection, Emily said. I'm not interested in leading with my employment status. I'm interested in making sure the sequence of what gets disclosed and how it gets handled in a way that protects Pelham and the other nursing staff who documented things under conditions that put them at professional risk. She paused. And I'm interested in making sure the Osei case gets a prosecutor who won't let it get managed into a lesser charge because Drath's legal team is going to be expensive and aggressive. Oakes had her notebook out. I can make a call about the Osei case. I know you can, Emily said. That's why I'm saying it to you. Harwick looked between them. Then he stood up, picked up the hard drive, and went to the door. Before he opened it, he turned back. For what it's worth, he said to Emily. The operational file from your classified service period. The 14 months you spent attached to the task force that first identified Meridian as a network. He paused. The file has a commendation recommendation attached to it. It's been sitting in a classification review queue for 3 years because the officer who submitted it retired before the review was completed and no one reinitiated the process. Emily looked at him. I know. It's being reinitiated today. He opened the door. I can't promise the timeline, but it's moving. He left. Oakes stayed standing near the window with her notebook, and for a moment the room was quiet in a way that felt less like the absence of sound and more like a specific pause between things. Are you all right? Oakes asked. Emily considered the question honestly, which was not the same as considering it at length. I will be, she said, when the sequence is complete. It was not the kind of answer that invited follow-up, and Oakes, who was perceptive enough to understand this, didn't offer one. The sequence began moving in earnest at 1:17 in the afternoon. It moved the way consequential things moved in institutions, not with the dramatic sudden rupture that stories preferred, but with the accumulating unstoppable weight of documented fact-meeting formal process. Federal agents executed the arrest warrant for Philip Drath at his Virginia office at 1:22 Eastern Time, 3 time zones away, and 2,000 miles from the Montana hospital where his network had been operating for 14 months. He was taken without incident, which was the terminology used when a man in a suit was handcuffed at his desk in a building with security cameras while his assistant stood in the doorway holding a coffee cup she'd forgotten she was holding. In Cutter's Bluff, the news arrived in the conference room as a brief text to Oakes's phone, which she read and then read aloud for the room's benefit. Drath in custody. Warrant executed 1:22 EST. The room, re-expanded now, Brierly and 2 other analysts back at their stations. Absorb this without visible celebration, because federal investigators generally didn't celebrate, or they celebrated later, privately, in ways that wouldn't appear in any record. But something in the room's collective posture shifted, the way posture shifts when a weight that has been managed for a long time is transferred to a different set of hands. Holt's formal federal arrest had happened 40 minutes earlier, at 12:37, in the hallway outside the conference room where he'd been giving his statement. He had been mid-sentence, something about the importance of clear chain of command in high-pressure medical environments, when two agents had come through the door and Oakes had set down her pen and told him he was under arrest for obstruction of a federal investigation, falsification of medical records, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and as a person of interest in the death of Bernard Osei. He had looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully classify. Not surprise, exactly. More the expression of a man discovering that the distance between where he thought he stood and where he actually stood was considerably larger than he'd calculated. "You need to specify which charges you're referring to," he said. His voice was steady. His hands were not. "We will," Oakes said. "Thoroughly, shall we?" He didn't speak again until his lawyer was present, which was his right, which he exercised, which changed nothing about the documented evidence already in federal custody. Emily was not in the hallway when Holt was arrested. She was on the second floor, in the small break room adjacent to the nursing station, drinking the first actual coffee she'd had since the previous evening and listening to the building rearrange itself around the morning's events. She could hear it, the change in pitch and frequency of the conversations in the corridors, the different quality of the silences in between. Institutions had their own acoustics when something fundamental shifted, and she had spent enough time in enough institutions to hear it clearly. Dr. Pelham came in at 1 o'clock with the expression of someone who had been talking to federal investigators for 2 hours and needed to sit down. She sat down. She looked at Emily's coffee. Emily got up without asking and poured her a cup from the machine on the counter, which produced coffee that was mediocre in the specific way of institutional coffee everywhere, and set it in front of her. "They're talking about the transfers," Pelham said. "All of them, going back a year. I gave them everything I had. The query I filed, the specific cases I remembered, the names of 2 other nurses who I knew had flagged things informally." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "Is Holt? Have they—" "He's in federal custody," Emily said. Pelham let out a long, slow breath. "He would have destroyed my career if I'd pushed harder at the time." "Yes," Emily said. "He probably would have. But I should have pushed harder anyway." Emily looked at her steadily. "You filed a query. You documented the truth on your tablet in real time. You told investigators what you knew when they asked." She paused. "That's not nothing. That's actually what made the first discrepancy visible. It doesn't feel like enough." "It rarely does while it's happening." Emily picked up her coffee. "That's not the same as it not being enough." Pelham was quiet for a moment, then, "What happens to the floor now? Administration is— Fitch is gone. Holt is gone. Half the people who ran this department for the past 3 years are apparently—" She made a gesture that covered the entirety of the morning's implications. "I've been a resident for 14 months. I don't know how this works. The board will appoint an interim. The hospital will be under federal oversight for the review period. It'll be disruptive." Emily set her cup down. "But the floor will function. The patients will be cared for. That part doesn't stop." "Are you—" Pelham stopped. "What? Are you coming back to the floor?" Emily didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't have an answer, but because the answer was more complicated than the question made room for, and she preferred not to compress things that deserved their actual shape. I don't know yet what the formal process looks like," she said finally, "but I'm not leaving Cutter's Bluff today." That seemed to be enough. Pelham nodded and drank her coffee, and they sat in the mediocre institutional quiet of the break room for a few minutes without filling it. At 1:45, Oakes appeared in the doorway. "The Admiral is awake," she said to Emily. "He's asking for you." The recovery room was dim in the specific way of post-surgical spaces. Controlled light, monitored quiet, the ambient sounds of equipment doing its steady, unglamorous work. Calloway was propped at a slight incline, the same posture as before his surgery, as if he'd specifically requested it. His color was better. His eyes were clear, which was notable given the anesthetic load a man in his condition would have received. He looked at Emily when she came in and said nothing for a moment. She sat in the chair beside the bed without waiting to be asked. They told me what was in the file, he said. Your file. All right. The classified portions are still restricted, but the index. He paused. 7 support actions with naval special warfare. The commendation recommendation. It's been in review for 3 years, she said. It's a slow process. I know how slow it is. His voice was quiet. I was the reviewing officer on 2 similar recommendations last year. I know exactly what the queue looks like, and I know exactly what it means when a recommendation sits in it for 3 years because a paperwork trail wasn't completed. Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, not quite the other thing, somewhere in the uncomfortable space between them. I pointed at you, in that lobby, in handcuffs. You acted on information you received. Information I should have questioned before I acted on it. He held her gaze. That is my error. I own it. I will not... He stopped, started again. I have spent 31 years in a branch of service that depends on accurate intelligence and correct attribution. I got both wrong this morning in a very visible way, and the fact that I was deliberately deceived does not change the outcome for you. Emily looked at him. No, she said. It doesn't, but it changes the intent, which is a different thing. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. He was quiet for a moment. Is there anything you need from me? Specifically. Right now, from whatever authority I have in this situation. She thought about it honestly, rather than reflexively. The Ose case, she said. Bernard Ose. He was a patient here who was transferred and died at a receiving facility. His family has been told his death was complications related. They don't know it's a homicide investigation. Calloway absorbed this. I can make calls. I know. I'm asking you to. She paused. His wife brought me cookies when he was recovering. She thought he was going to be all right. The room was quiet for a moment. I'll make the calls today, he said, before I make any other calls. She nodded. Thank you. She stood up and he said her name and she turned. Harwick told me the commendation review is being reinitiated, he said. I want you to know that's not the full extent of what I intend to do with whatever time and influence this situation has left me. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. She left the recovery room and walked back through the corridor, and the hospital moved around her with the slightly altered rhythm of a place that was beginning to understand what had happened in it and what would happen next. Staff she passed looked at her differently than they had at 7:30 that morning, though some of them looked away quickly, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. At the nursing station on the 2nd floor, Warren was behind the desk reviewing a visitor log with the careful focus of a man who had decided to be very good at his job today specifically. He looked up when Emily passed. Your box, he said. From the lobby. It's in the back office. I put it there when... He stopped. I didn't want it to just sit out. Thank you, Warren. The card's still in it, he said. I made sure. She held his gaze for a moment. I know you did. She went to the back office and picked up the cardboard box and carried it to the break room and set it on the table and opened it. The card was on top, because Warren had put it there, and she picked it up and held it for a moment without opening it. She already knew what it said, had read it enough times that the words were simply part of her. And then she set it back carefully. The other contents of the box: 2 granola bar wrappers, a spare pair of compression socks, travel-sized hand lotion. Nothing significant. Everything familiar. She was still sitting there when Brierly appeared in the doorway with a tablet in her hand and the expression of someone carrying information she hadn't fully caught up with yet. We pulled the phone data from Holt's device, Brierly said. The message he sent to Drawl during the interview session, the one that sent Drawl to the Trauma Bay workstation. She turned the tablet toward Emily. It's there. Time-stamped. Clear as anything. That's the obstruction charge with teeth, Oakes says. Good. Emily looked at the tablet. The message was 3 lines. She read it without expression. There's something else, Brierly said. She hesitated in a way that was uncharacteristic. Brierly was not a person who hesitated, which meant what was coming required a different gear. In the communications archive from Holt's device, there's a message from 4 months ago, addressed to the Meridian Network's contact channel. She paused. He reported you, specifically, by name and by his assessment of what you were investigating. He described you as... She looked at the tablet. A persistent operational liability with potential classified background that could not be managed through standard HR mechanisms and would require external resolution. The room was very quiet. Emily looked at the tablet for a long moment. External resolution, the specific language of a network that had killed Bernard Ose, applied to her 4 months ago by the man who had fired her that morning. She had been, for 4 months, a flag target, and she hadn't known. The hand lotion in the cardboard box, the compression socks, Donald Pruitt's card. She looked at them and then at the window and the flat Montana sky beyond it, and she sat with the particular quality of feeling that arrived when you understood that the danger you'd been moving through was larger than you'd known, and you were only finding out now, from the other side of it, that the size had been hidden from you all along. She breathed once, slowly. Oakes needs to see that message, she said. She's already seen it. Brierly paused. She wanted you to know. Emily nodded. She set the tablet on the table and looked at the cardboard box and was quiet for a moment. One more thing, Brierly said. Her voice had shifted again, not softer, but differently calibrated. This came through from the Pentagon 20 minutes ago, the classification review that Harwick reinitiated. She held out a single printed page. Emily took it. It was a formal notification, short, institutional in its language, precise in its implications. She read it once, and then set it face down on the table beside the box and said nothing. Brierly waited a moment, then said, Is that what I think it is? Depends on what you think it is, Emily said. Brierly looked at the page and back at Emily. It says approved, for the Silver Star recommendation. Approved, and... She stopped. It says ceremony. It's scheduling a formal ceremony. Emily picked up her coffee, which had gone cold, and drank it anyway. Yes, she said. She sat with the weight of that word in a break room that smelled of institution coffee and floor wax, with a cardboard box on the table in front of her and a face-down page beside it, and outside in the hallway the sounds of the hospital moving through the aftermath of a morning that was not yet finished. Because it wasn't finished. She knew that because Oakes had been in the conference room for the past 40 minutes with a closed door in the entire Meridian Financial Archive, and Harwick had been on a call with Virginia for the past half hour. And the thing about networks with 17 layers of corporate structure was that the arrest of the person at the top was not the end of the operational picture. It was the beginning of the dismantling. And dismantling required people who understood the architecture. She was still sitting there when Oakes opened the break room door with her phone in her hand and looked at Emily with an expression that was not quite urgency, but was adjacent to it. The Meridian Network Archive, Oakes said. The full operational file that Harwick brought on the hard drive. Our analysts have been running it against known personnel for the past 2 hours. She paused. There are 2 names in the facility contact list for Ridgeline Memorial. We have Holt. We have Fitch. She looked at Emily. There's a 3rd name. Emily looked up. The 3rd name has active building access, Oakes said, and they've been in the building all day. Who? Emily said. Oakes turned her phone screen around. A name. A photograph beside it pulled from the hospital's staff directory. A face Emily had seen dozens of times in the past 2 years, enough times that it had become part of the visual furniture of the building, the kind of face you stopped actively registering because it was always simply there. Dr. Stuart Vance, hospitalist, 3rd floor attending. Emily looked at the photograph for 2 seconds. Then she stood up. Vance had been in the building since 6:40 that morning. His badge access showed him entering through the staff entrance on the east side, which was 12 minutes before the convoy hit the IED, and 22 minutes before the first military vehicle appeared in the ambulance bay. He had been on the 3rd floor for most of the morning, which put him in proximity to the Admiral's recovery suite, to the surgical prep area, and to the conference room the investigators had been using since 9 o'clock. His access log shows him badging into the surgical prep corridor at 11:50, Oakes said, already moving toward the door. The Admiral was in prep until 12:10. Emily was beside her in the hallway before Oakes finished the sentence. They moved fast, not running, because running in a hospital produced a specific response in every person who saw it, and this situation required controlled speed rather than visible urgency. Oakes had 2 agents on the 3rd floor already. She'd called ahead in the 30 seconds it took to walk from the break room to the stairwell, and her radio was in her hand with the volume dropped to a murmur that only carried to her own ear. The stairwell door opened onto the third-floor corridor, and Oakes's two agents were visible at the far end, positioned near the nursing station with the casual deliberateness of people who had been told to watch a specific point without appearing to watch it. One of them gave a minimal head tilt. Northeast. Vance was in the corridor that ran past the recovery suite. Emily knew this floor's geography the way she knew every floor of this building, where the corridors dead-ended, which supply rooms connected to adjacent hallways, where the sight lines broke. She moved to the left of Oakes, taking the angle that covered the supply corridor junction, because if Vance understood that the situation was closing, the supply corridor was the fastest route to the service elevator. He was not at the recovery suite door. He was 12 feet past it, at the small workstation alcove that staff used for chart access between rooms, and he had a tablet in his hand and the focused, routine posture of a physician making notes, except that his badge was at an angle that partially obscured his face from the nursing station's line of sight, and the tablet in his hand was tilted at an angle that didn't match the posture of someone reading. I was typing. Oakes's voice, quiet and direct. Dr. Vance. He looked up. The sequence of his expression lasted less than a second but contained several complete things: recognition, calculation, and then the specific quality of a man deciding between two options and understanding that neither of them was good. He chose composure, which was the expected choice, and he lowered the tablet and turned with the measured ease of a senior physician responding to a colleague. Agent Oakes. He nodded. His eyes moved briefly to Emily, and in that movement something flickered that was not professional neutrality, something older and more operational. Is there something I can help with? We'd like you to come with us, Oakes said. Of course. He set the tablet on the workstation. Let me just finish the... Leave the tablet, Oakes said. A pause. Not long, but present. All right, he said. He came with them, and an agent collected the tablet, and they walked the corridor toward the conference room with the controlled, quiet efficiency of a situation being managed before it could become something visible to the floor. Past the nursing station, past the elevator bank, through the conference room door. He sat down across from Oakes with his hands folded, and he looked at the whiteboard with its 4 words and the lines between them, and he looked at Emily standing near the window, and his composure held in the surface way that composure held when the person underneath it was running a very fast and very private calculation. Your contact in the Meridian network, Oakes said. She didn't frame it as a question. The communications were routed through a medical literature subscription service's internal messaging function. Sophisticated. She opened a folder on the table in front of her. Not sophisticated enough. Vance looked at the folder. He didn't reach for it. The tablet you were using at the workstation, Oakes continued, was accessing the same messaging function. Timestamp puts it at 11 minutes after Holt's arrest was communicated internally. You were alerting the network. She paused. The message didn't send. We had the outbound traffic flagged. Something moved across Vance's face. Not defeat, not yet. More the expression of someone revising their options inventory in real time and finding it shorter than they'd anticipated. I'd like to speak with an attorney, he said. That's your right, Oakes said. Before we arrange that, I want you to understand the scope of what we have. Not as a negotiating position, just as a factual matter. She opened the folder. 14 months of communication records. Financial transfers totaling, she glanced at the page, $312,000 from a Meridian-linked account to a numbered account that traces to a holding company registered in your wife's maiden name. She looked at him steadily. Your wife, who has not, as far as we can determine, been involved in any of this. But the account is in her name, which creates a legal exposure that I expect your attorney will want to address very quickly. The composure cracked. Not visibly. A person watching from the doorway wouldn't have caught it. But Emily was 6 feet away and she saw it, the involuntary tightening around his eyes, the very small movement of his jaw. She didn't know, he said. Then helping us understand the full scope of your involvement is the fastest path to making sure that's clearly established in the record. Oakes's voice was even, not kind, not cruel, accurate. Bernard Ose, walk me through your role in his transfer. A long silence. Vance looked at his hands. When he looked up, the composure was still there, but it was different now, thinner, like something that had been under pressure for too long and had changed its molecular structure without anyone noticing until it began to give. "I didn't know he was going to die," he said. "Tell me what you did know." It took 40 minutes. Emily stayed in the room for the first 20 until she understood the shape of what was being disclosed and was certain that Pelham and the nursing staff who'd filed informal concerns were not in Vance's operational picture. They hadn't been. They were peripheral noise to him, people who noticed things but didn't know what they were noticing, and then she went to the door. Oakes looked at her from across the table. Emily gave a minimal nod. Oakes understood it, whatever it meant to her, and turned back to Vance, and Emily walked out into the corridor and stood for a moment with her hand still on the door handle and the flat Montana afternoon light coming through the window at the end of the hall. 3 Meridian contacts at Ridgeline Memorial, all of them now in federal custody or actively cooperating. The upstream, Drath, arrested in Virginia. The operational network disrupted at the facility level, the financial level, and the command level simultaneously, which was the kind of simultaneous disruption that took years to build toward and happened in the space of a single day when enough threads pulled at once. Bernard Osei had been dead for 5 months. His wife had thanked Emily with cookies and believed her husband had died of complications. Nothing about today fixed that. Emily knew that clearly and held it alongside everything else. The way you held things that couldn't be resolved and didn't pretend they could. Some debts in the human ledger didn't get paid, they just got witnessed. She walked to the window. Outside, the ambulance bay had quieted. 2 federal vehicles remained. The winter light was doing what winter light did in this part of Montana at mid-afternoon, going flat and gray at the edges, the quality of illumination that made the landscape look both very large and very indifferent. She was still at the window when she heard the elevator open behind her and the sound of a gurney wheel she recognized as coming from the recovery ward transport system, and she turned. Admiral Raymond Calloway was not on the gurney. He was walking beside it, which his surgical team had clearly not advised, with one hand on the rail and the other hand carrying an IV line that an annoyed-looking nurse was trying to manage from his other side. He was pale and moving with the particular careful deliberateness of a man running a manual check on every function, but he was upright, which appeared to be a matter of some personal importance to him. He saw Emily at the window, and he stopped walking. The nurse said something quiet and urgent. He held up a hand, not dismissively, more the hand of someone who needed a moment and knew how to ask for one, and she stopped. He looked at Emily across the length of the corridor, 15 feet, the afternoon light between them. "They told me about Vance," he said. "Just now?" 5 minutes ago." He looked older than he had in the recovery room, which was what happened when the residual anesthetic wore off and the real weight of a day settled into a person's face. "I authorized his staff credentials 8 months ago. He was on the recommendation list for a medical advisory position with our unit's health services component." A pause. "I signed off on it without review. My aide handled the vetting." "Standard protocol," Emily said. Standard protocol that Meridian apparently anticipated and exploited. His jaw was tight. "They placed him 8 months ago. They were planning this 8 months ago." "Probably longer," Emily said. "Not to wound him, because it was true." Networks like Meridian work on long timelines. The placement, the recruitment of Holt, the financial infrastructure, this was years of setup. You couldn't have seen it from where you were standing. "I should have, Admiral." She said it quietly, but with the weight of 14 months of classified operational work behind it, the weight of understanding how adversarial networks operated and how even the most careful people moved through environments that had been deliberately arranged against them. "You were the target, not the failure point." He was quiet for a moment. The nurse beside him had given up arguing and was simply managing the IV line with professional patience. "I want to make a statement," Calloway said, "to the hospital staff, before I'm transported to the federal facility for recovery." He looked at her. "I want you there." She held his gaze. "All right." It took another hour to arrange. The surgical team negotiated Calloway down from standing in the main lobby to standing, briefly, with a chair immediately available, in the emergency department's central bay, which was where the largest concentration of staff could gather without abandoning patient care. And the word went out through the floor communication system in the careful, institutional language that hospitals used for mandatory staff briefings. By 3:40, the bay was as full as it could be without compromising the operational core. Nurses from every floor who were off active patient duty. The residents. Administrators who remained, the outer ring of the administrative structure. The ones who hadn't known what Holt and Fitch were doing and were only now beginning to understand the full scope of what they'd been standing adjacent to for over a year. Maintenance staff, lab techs, the woman from the cafeteria who'd been there for 22 years and who Emily knew brought homemade soup to the night shift staff on cold weeks. Warren was near the back. He had his arms crossed, and his expression was the carefully neutral expression of a man who felt things strongly and had learned to contain it in professional settings. Pelham was near the front, standing beside two other residents, all three of them with the particular posture of people who had aged a measurable amount since 7 o'clock that morning. Emily stood to the right of the bay entrance, slightly apart from the gathered staff, which was where she'd positioned herself because it gave her sight lines in multiple directions, and because she was not, despite everything, someone who defaulted to the center of a room unless the task required it. Calloway stood at the bay's central point. The chair was 2 feet behind him. He did not use it. The nurse managing his IV had accepted the situation with the resignation of someone who had already lost this particular argument. He looked at the room. He took a moment to do it properly, the way a man who'd spent 31 years in command roles looked at rooms, not surveying, actually looking. "I owe most of you an explanation," he said, "and one person in this room considerably more than that." His voice carried without effort. The room was quiet in the way rooms went quiet when the person speaking had earned it. He walked through it concisely, the way military briefings moved, sequenced, clear, without ornament. The convoy, the IED, his arrival, the false information he'd received and acted on, the woman he'd had handcuffed in the lobby of her own workplace on her first hour of unemployment. He didn't soften it. He didn't use the passive voice. He said, "I was deceived, and I acted on that deception, and the consequence of my action fell on someone who deserved none of it." The room listened. "Emily Carver," he said, "saved my life this morning. Not as a matter of professional routine. She had been fired. She had been publicly dismissed. She had every reason to walk out of this building and not look back." He paused. "She came into that bay because there was a patient who needed what she knew how to do, and she did it. And then she walked back out and waited while the institution that had just fired her tried to build a case against her using lies that someone in this building helped manufacture." Another pause. "She waited. She didn't fight it publicly. She didn't make a scene. She just waited and let the truth take the time it needed to become visible." The room was very still. "That is not a small thing," Calloway said. "That is one of the harder things a person can do. Most of us, in that situation, would have made noise, demanded immediate vindication, and that would have been understandable. She didn't. She had the discipline to understand that the truth was already there, and that her job was simply to not compromise the conditions that would allow it to surface." He turned his head slightly toward where Emily stood. "So I need to say this where it can be heard," he said, "by everyone who watched what happened in that lobby this morning. I was wrong. The error was mine. The record will reflect that." He reached into the breast pocket of the hospital gown, which his aide had clearly managed to bring from somewhere because it was his actual uniform jacket, and no one had apparently told him it was not standard post-surgical attire, and produced a folded document. "The commendation recommendation that has been in classification review for 3 years has been approved and formally submitted as of today. The ceremony will be scheduled through Naval Command in the next 30 days. He held the document toward Emily. "This is the notification copy. It belongs to you." Emily walked the 6 feet between them and took it. She didn't look at it. She already knew what it said. She looked at Calloway, and he looked back, and there was a brief moment that contained a great deal: acknowledgement, the specific weight of a wrong being named publicly and owned completely, and the particular quality of two people who had operated in classified environments looking at each other with the mutual understanding that some things couldn't be fully articulated in rooms full of people and didn't need to be. She nodded once. He nodded back. From the room, a sound that started at the back. Warren, she thought, though she didn't look, and moved forward the way sounds moved in spaces where people had been holding their breath. Not applause exactly, at first, more the collective exhale of a group of people releasing something they'd been holding since 7:50 that morning, since the lobby, since the handcuffs clicked. And then it became applause, imperfect and uncoordinated the way real things were, some people starting before others, someone near the front who did a short 3-clap before catching the rhythm, The cafeteria woman who put two fingers in her mouth and produced a whistle that cut through the room like a ship's bell. Emily stood with the folded notification in her hand and did not perform humility and did not perform strength. She stood the way she had stood in the lobby with the handcuffs on, present, composed, without the armor of performance. And she let the room be what it was. Pelham, from near the front, was not applauding. She was looking at Emily with the specific expression of someone who had understood something that morning that they were going to carry for the rest of their professional life. Not a lesson exactly, something more operational than a lesson, something about what it cost to document the truth under pressure and what the alternative cost more. Emily met her eyes. She gave her the minimal nod that she'd given Pelham in the break room and in the trauma bay, and that meant simply, "You did the right thing, and I know it wasn't easy, and it mattered." Pelham straightened slightly, lifted her chin a fraction, looked forward. That was enough. The administrative consequences moved through the following days with the particular momentum of federal proceedings that had substantial documentation and multiple cooperating witnesses. Marcus Holt's medical license was suspended by the state board within 48 hours of his arrest, pending the outcome of the federal charges: obstruction, falsification of records, conspiracy, and the OSE-related count that the federal prosecutor had charged as second-degree murder given the evidentiary standard around the pharmacological mechanism. His attorney entered a not guilty plea and immediately began the process of building a defense that was going to be expensive and, in the estimation of the federal prosecutors, insufficient. Stuart Vance's cooperation agreement was executed 4 days after his arrest. He provided full operational detail on the Meridian contact structure, the specific communication protocols, and the mechanism by which OSE's transfer had been arranged and managed. The cooperation agreement reduced his exposure on the conspiracy charges, but left the OSE-related count on the table pending the prosecutor's review of his level of direct involvement. His wife's name was cleared from the financial record. He lost his medical license. He would not practice again. Glenn Fitch was charged separately on the administrative conspiracy counts and on a wire fraud charge connected to the falsification of the compliance reports he'd filed internally for 14 months. His attorney negotiated a plea within the first week. He resigned from the hospital formally. The resignation letter was 3 sentences, the language of a man who had used all his words elsewhere. Kevin Drawl, the facilities manager who had accessed Holt's office and attempted the second round of record modifications, cooperated fully from the moment of his arrest. His attorney's position was that he'd been directed by Holt without full understanding of the legal exposure he was taking on, which was partially accurate and partially the kind of argument that federal prosecutors received with the measured skepticism of people who had heard it before. His plea reduced his charges to a single obstruction count. He spent 4 months in a federal facility and lost his facilities management certification permanently. The hospital board appointed an interim chief of medicine within 72 hours. A woman named Dr. Audra Saltz, brought in from a regional hospital administration network, who arrived on her first morning with the particular energy of someone who had been briefed thoroughly and had no patience for the idea that what had been done here could simply be absorbed and moved past. She called a staff meeting on her first afternoon and said, without preamble, "What happened here was not invisible. People saw it and reported it and were ignored or retaliated against. That will not happen on my watch. Tell me what you need." Several people told her. She wrote it down. Emily's reinstatement was formally processed on the 4th day following the arrests. The hospital's legal team had been in contact with Oakes's office regarding the conditions of the termination almost immediately, and the picture that emerged, the coordination between Holt and Fitch in manufacturing the disciplinary record, the suppression of Emily's incident report, the specific timing of her firing relative to the Admiral's arrival, made the legal position of the hospital in contesting reinstatement untenable and brief. Back pay was calculated. The false disciplinary record was formally expunged. The incident report she had filed 11 months ago against Holt was reinstated to its original status and annotated with the outcome of the federal proceedings. She was offered the floor charge nurse position. She declined it, politely and without explanation, which was her right. What she accepted was different. Calloway had made calls, as he'd said he would, from his federal recovery room in the days following his surgery. The calls produced a meeting, and the meeting produced a proposal, and the proposal was for something that didn't fully exist yet: a joint military-civilian trauma training program federally funded, designed to develop emergency medical capacity across regional facilities that served military-adjacent populations in areas with limited Level Y access. The program needed a director, someone who understood both operational field medicine and civilian trauma protocols, someone who could train residents and senior nursing staff and military medics in a shared language that bridged the institutional gap between those two worlds, a gap that had cost lives in ways that mostly went unexamined because the people on both sides of it were too busy trying to function within their own systems to map the space between. Emily read the proposal in the break room where she'd sat with Donald Pruitt's card, and the travel-sized hand lotion, and the cold coffee, and she read it twice, and then she set it down and looked at the window. She thought about Bernard Osei and his wife and the cookies. She thought about the 14-year-old with the fentanyl exposure whose terrified parents had held hands in the waiting room until 3 in the morning. She thought about Dr. Pelham at the gurney, making the right call under pressure, writing down the truth on her tablet before anyone told her it mattered. She thought about the 18 months she'd spent attached to a task force that operated in the space between classified and unclassifiable, doing the kind of work that kept people alive in situations where the margin for error was zero, and the documentation of that work had spent 3 years in a review queue because the paperwork hadn't been completed. She thought about Warren putting Donald Pruitt's card on top of the box so it wouldn't get lost. She picked up the proposal and read it a third time, more slowly. She accepted it on a Thursday afternoon by calling the number on the cover page and saying yes without preamble, because the people on the other end of that call didn't need preamble, and she didn't have any that would add to what the word already contained. The commendation ceremony happened on a Friday, 26 days after the morning she'd sat in the lobby with a cardboard box. It was not a large ceremony, military commendations rarely were, in her experience, and she preferred the absence of spectacle around things that had happened in conditions that spectacle couldn't touch. It was held in a conference room at the Federal Building in Helena, with Calloway officiating from a chair because his surgical team had finally won the argument about standing for extended periods, and Harwick present, and Oakes, and 2 naval officers whose names Emily recognized from the operational period, and who she had not expected to see again in any context that didn't involve a redacted document. Pelham came. Emily hadn't asked her to, but Pelham had found out through channels that Emily didn't investigate and had driven 4 hours from Cutter's Bluff on her day off and arrived 10 minutes early in a coat that was slightly too formal for the room, which was its own kind of statement. Warren came too, also on his day off, also in a slightly too formal coat, and Emily noticed that the two of them arrived within a minute of each other in the parking lot and walked in together, which was a detail she filed away with the other details she'd been collecting about the ways people oriented toward each other when they thought no one was paying attention. Calloway read the commendation text. He read it fully, without abbreviation, which was not always done, but which he'd apparently decided was appropriate for this specific case, and that was his call to make as the officiating officer. The text covered the operational period without naming the specific missions, the classification still held on those, but named her role, her designation, her medical specialty, and the specific nature of the commendation recommendation in language that was precise and formal, and underneath its institutional structure conveyed the actual thing it was trying to convey. When he pinned the medal to her lapel, he was standing. He'd won that argument with himself, if not with his surgical team. And he looked at her with the directness of a man who had fully owned what he'd gotten wrong and was standing on the other side of it. "Well done," he said. Not loudly. The specific private register of someone saying a thing they meant completely. "Thank you, Admiral," she said. She did not cry. She had not cried at any point in the 26 days, which was not because she hadn't felt things, but because she processed things differently, always had, in the specific way of people who had spent years in environments where the weight of what was happening couldn't be carried in real time and had to be deferred and handled later, in smaller pieces. At 2 in the morning, when the shift was over and the parking structure was quiet, she would handle it later. That was all right. What she felt right now, standing in a too formal conference room in Helena with a medal on her lapel and Pelham in the back row, and Warren 3 seats over from Pelham and Calloway, looking at her with the full weight of a man who had finally gotten something right. What she felt was simpler and harder to name than any of the things the morning of the 26th day had seemed to promise. It was not triumph. It was something quieter and more durable than triumph. It was the feeling of standing in the correct place after a very long time of being pushed toward the wrong one. She looked at the room, at Oakes, who had her notebook out, because some people never stopped being what they were, and that was not a flaw. At Harwick, who had aged 3 years in the past month and looked more honest for it. At the 2 naval officers who understood what the redacted portions of the commendation text actually contained and were therefore looking at her with a kind of recognition that had nothing to perform and nothing to prove. She looked at Pelham, who was sitting straight in her too formal coat with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes holding the expression of someone who had come 4 hours to see something confirmed that they'd already believed and needed to see confirmed anyway. She looked at Warren, who was not a man who attended ceremonies or drove 3 hours on his day off, and who was here. She thought about what Calloway had said in the hospital bay, about waiting and letting the truth take the time it needed to become visible. He'd said it as though it were a discipline she'd chosen. That wasn't entirely accurate. She had waited because she understood from years of operational work that truth was not a fragile thing. It didn't need to be shouted to survive. It needed to be documented. It needed to be witnessed. It needed the conditions that allowed it to be found by the people with the authority and the tools to act on it. She had been those conditions. That was her part. Not the heroism, the patience, the documentation, the willingness to file the report and wait, to write down what she saw and trust that somewhere in the system there were people like Pelham and Brierley and Oakes who would do the same. That was not a small thing. She had not always known that. She knew it now. 3 weeks after the ceremony, she drove back to Cutter's Bluff for the last time in her capacity as a Ridgeline Memorial employee. She had boxes to collect, real ones this time, more of them, the accumulated contents of a locker and a storage cubby, and the small framed photograph she'd kept on the nursing station desk for 2 years. A mountain range at dawn shot by a photographer whose name she'd never found, which she'd bought at a gas station outside Billings 6 years ago for $4. She found the photograph and put it in a box and stood at the nursing station one more time. The floor was mid-morning busy, the rhythm she knew, the specific frequencies of organized urgency. A monitor alarmed somewhere and was silenced. 2 residents moved past with the focused, slightly frantic energy of people being tested by something they weren't sure they were ready for. Pelham appeared from around the corner, already in scrubs, already in motion. She stopped when she saw Emily. "You're taking the mountain picture," she said. "It was mine." "I know." Pelham looked at the box. "When does the program start?" "Formally in 60 days. Unofficially, I'm already writing the curriculum." Pelham nodded slowly. "If the program ever needs a resident consultant, someone who's been in both environments, civilian and the field-adjacent protocols." She stopped. "I know I'm not qualified yet, but eventually." Emily looked at her. "Write that down," she said. "When you're ready, I'll read it." It was not a promise of anything except a fair hearing, which was what Pelham was asking for and the right thing to ask for, and the only thing Emily could offer that was worth offering. Pelham nodded. She looked like she wanted to say something else and decided against it, and then said it anyway. "I'm glad you came back into that bay." Emily picked up the box. "So am I." She walked out through the ER, past the trauma bay with its clean, reset surfaces, past the lobby bench where the cardboard box had sat, through the automatic doors that cycled open without ceremony. The ambulance bay was quiet, cold, the specific dry cold of Montana in the period between winter and whatever came next. She put the box in her car and stood for a moment beside the open door with the mountain air on her face. She thought about what she was walking toward rather than what she was leaving. The program. The curriculum. The gap between 2 worlds of medicine that she was uniquely positioned to map and bridge, not because she was exceptional, though she was, and she no longer felt the need to qualify that, but because she had been on both sides of it, and had survived both sides of it, and had documented both sides of it with the particular precision of someone who understood that the truth of what you'd done was only useful to anyone else if you'd written it down clearly enough for them to find. She had been dismissed as just a nurse by people who needed her to be small enough to manage. She had been handcuffed in a hospital lobby by an admiral who'd been deceived by a network that understood correctly that she was dangerous to them, not because she was aggressive or loud, but because she was thorough and patient and impossible to make go away. She was still here. She got in the car and drove north out of Cutter's Bluff, toward the mountains that were the same mountains in the $4 photograph now sitting in the box on the back seat, and she drove the way she moved through everything, forward, with her hands steady, watching what was ahead and what was coming. The road was clear.